we asked him to do something up in Fort Lennox, I think, or Saint Jean, Quebec, and he wanted to know how long it was, and he remarked, he said, you know, about the second hour you've got that on your shoulder, you know it's there.
Yeah, that's true.
Is that right, Calvin? Guess right?
Again. Well, our little corner, without really intending to do it, is making the rounds inside the Clinton County Government Center, downtown Plattsburgh. We've interviewed a number of different people. We've gotten some terrific insight into some of the different jobs people do around here. And now, I got a nice easy chair and I get to talk to one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Clinton County historian Addie Shields. How are you, Addie?
Well, I'm fine when I hear you with all your palaver.
The last time I talked to Addie on camera, we were on board the Juniper,
Yeah.
watching the raising of the Confiance anchor. That was a nice day.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
And you weren't at all at a loss for words that day, were you?
None of us.
It's, you know, she and I have had some delicious conversations. That's the only way I can describe it, because you are so passionate about the history of Clinton County and the North Country, and you know so many things about so many people. Nobody would dare to get out of line within your eyesight or earshot, because you'd have them right down there in the family tree. How did you first get interested in history?
As you talked, though, I couldn't help but think what's coming, you know. Let me say that when I was a child, our life, our social life, we were all very programmed, and our social life was the church, our grandmothers. We did what everybody else was doing. We were always helping. If they were thrashing, we were feeding the men. Or if it was strawberry time, you were picking as many berries as you could, so that when the snow flew, you'd have, and the wind would blow, you'd have something to eat. We worked all the time, and so when we talked, I think of, and you should know this, I think this is a perfect example of how people get into history. How did Nell Sullivan write that Shazy history book? How did she get into history? I've thought of this so much. The one that Dave Martin published with her. When I was a little girl, our neighboring farm was the Scribner farm. Now that's the old Minor Lewis farm, to Ceylon McFadden, to Will Scribner, and to Bulrus, and I think Lapeer, and a part of it belongs to Hobbs's now, the part on the ridge. But a perfect example was that there was a grandma there, and she was my grandmother's friend, and she got the shingles. And the first I ever knew about Nell Jane Barnett, she came to take care of Grandma Scribner when she had the shingles. Now you know that when anybody has the shingles, what can you do for them? Nothing.
How
Talk
well
to
I know.
Talk
I
to
went
them.
through that
Talk to
episode,
them.
yeah.
And so as she went around the countryside, she absorbed a little bit of talk here and a little bit of talk there. And you know, that was our lives. My father could recite the history book. Our grandmothers persuaded us to read the Bible and to know the commandments. And how do we get into this? And I thought of it in the ice storm, during the ice storm, when people were confined. Those were the days when a little girl sat beside her grandmother and she learned to knit and purl. I think of no other way of, you know, you just kind of absorb it. And as time goes on and you're responsible and somebody dies, when John Ray died, I remember that Dr. J. Lawrence Evans brought me 9 Bibles, honest, and my husband looked at those and said, now where are you going to put those, you know? But I just...
9 Bibles?
9 Bibles, and that was the start of our Bible records that we have here, because you can't house all the Bibles, but you can house that little section that has the vital statistics, the births, deaths, and the marriages. So one belonged to Reed's, and I took that to Florence Reed and so forth, and I gave the Pierce one to the Jim Lombard's family and so forth. You follow? And I have the John Ray Bible, the John Ray, which is the old Joel Smith Bible, and it's in 1816. I have that at home along with some others. But you know, and the other thing is, you're responsible. You know, always in the country. if you were asked to do something or if something happened, there was always somebody had a specialization. Somebody owned, I think of my father putting up wood. He would cut his own pole wood and haul it down, you know, because every year when you're burning some, you've got to cut some green so it'll be dry for next year. And so he would haul down, he'd cut the pole wood and bring it down. But then we had a neighbor, Mr. Ranlett, and Mr. Ranlett owned a circular saw, which cost money. And so my father would go and help Mr. Ranlett saw his wood and maybe somebody else's, because you see his time wasn't worth as much as that steel round blade, right? And so you heard what happened there, and you also read the paper and so forth. You follow me? And you had your relatives who were writing, but wait just a minute. And every Christmas you had books, you know.
You just got involved because your parents were involved in history. You were interested.
Everybody.
You were always
That was
interested
table
in
conversation.
family.
If my father went to cut wood with Mr. Ranlett down there, Mrs. Ranlett was Dr. Stiles' sister, and the Stileses were a fine farm. You know, if you go up on Route 190 over here on the turnpike and you see the old Robinson Tavern, and you go a little further, there's a little slip up into the hill there, and that's where the old Stiles house is. And you know, one of the other things I've thought of as I travel around through the, is this what you want? Wrong?
You're
right?
doing it just
All right.
Don't stop
As you
now.
travel along the countryside, especially if you know the Beers map, which pinpointed all the people in 1869, but by then there were quite a few of them. But if you think about the first settlers who came, and when they surveyed a piece of land, and where they put their house on that piece of land, you know, like old Captain Jersey, I never thought about it until as you leave Beekmantown and you go up that Jersey Swamp Road, Mr. Jersey's house is way up there. And you go up there, ooh, you got the most beautiful view of the lake, but you wonder how he found that high place. Then as you look at the old first houses, they all were up somewhere. You look at on the Shazy Landing Road, the Beaucaire Farm, how it's on a little rise there, you can see the lake. You know, too, when I travel, I've been very interested in the Reynolds Road, because Ingraham, that old tavern that's there, and I followed through, and I might not be able to do it correctly, but the old 1835, the Burr maps do not have, I can't explain this good, do not have a connecting road on the Shazy Landing Road from, you know where Alfie Zett lives, where the Point Rush Fire Station is, you go straight down. They had not bridged that creek that's there, where the Riley Brook comes from Conroy's and goes down through to Monty's Bay. Mm-hmm. All right. And you tie in with, we know we've been thinking about the War of 1812 and so forth, but you got a tavern up there, and it says 1800 on it. And it's Nell Sullivan and the Friends of Shazy that put that up there. And you wonder, how come that tavern? But you start down that road and you go for 2 miles. You go for 2 miles till you get to the lake. And when you get to the lake, and then in reverse it and think, how'd that tavern get back up there? How did they build it up there? Well, you know, I do believe that was absolutely all timber. And in history, and I rely on Nell Sullivan for this, they built a tavern and it burned, and they built another and it burned, and they built that one. So it's the third one, but that's where the north-south road was. Ingraham to the Esker, it was up there.
Yeah.
Plus, all these people from Monty's Bay, you know, you got all that beautiful flat up there, they were cutting the timber off from, you follow, and sure, they were. The other bit is that Monty's Bay, on that little belly there in the corner, if you look, that's the one place where they must have made, where they put rafts together, because if they were putting rafts together in May and June and you had to be out there, those men had nothing on their feet, and you know that a great deal of the shore of Lake Champlain is rocky, but that was soft. That's where the rafts were built, right there where Mr. Dragoon has a house. You know what I mean? At the end of the Reynolds Road. So all that timber must have come there. Well, the men had to sleep somewhere. The man that catered to them was that Ingraham Tavern, and I believe, see, in 1800, because this is 1788, you know, you got all those years in there, 12 years to to get money enough to build that. I do believe that that's where they got the money. The people who were cutting this timber were living. Where were they living? But also, that tavern was on the north-south road because the Chazy Landing Road wasn't there because they didn't put a bridge there till about 1900. But you wonder why you figure this.
Yeah, but you know, it takes an exceptional person
No.
and an exceptional personality to be able to develop this continuum in your mind. To drive out there and say, here's the tavern, why was that here?
Well,
What fields were out there? And what was going on down here? And where was the lake?
Well, you're looking-
and then to draw that picture. But that's what history is, a picture of time.
I guess so. You know, even Van Tyne's, you know, when we did the Pathway of the British, Van Tyne, where Trombley is, where he has that run of John Deere tractors, that wonderful.
Sure.
All right. Would you believe, you look at the slope of that land slopes to the southeast, and therefore if you were going to put 2, 3, 4, 5, I think they talked 10,000 soldiers there, or if you're going to, I think it's 6, but if you're going to put soldiers there, you've got to have drainage. You don't put soldiers in a wet hole. And so that when I look at, and they raise wonderful alfalfa. They have early crops because it looks the south. You got your right heat and so forth from the sun. But my grandson was here. He's out in Detroit. And he said to me, Grandma, when you turn from the Ashley Road and you're going down what is the the Slauson Road. When you turn from the Ashley Road and you're going down the Slauson Road, what's that I see over there? Well, you know what this is? Alabama. And we never noticed it before until the ice storm. Because you go down that road and you know you're going to Ingraham, you're going to Ben Sanger's, you know, you're going to Beggs's, you're going over the thruway to Beggs's. All the time, the distance over there is the south end of Alamont. And that hit him because he'd never seen it before, but it's because of the destruction of the trees. You followed previous to this, I've been interested in the trees too, because during the summer, they develop symmetry, a pom-pom up here, and then when the leaves all fell, they kind of became macabre again. Yeah.
And we'll pay that price for a long, long time.
Yeah.
All right, so we know you're interested in history. When did you get this job first? When did you become an official historian? We know you were a person that was very interested in history. At what point in your life did you think, golly, I'd like to do this for a living?
Well, you know, I never asked for this job. This job came to me. They had a meeting and they had asked someone to leave. And Flora Mayette, who was the DAR, Flora Mayette, and you remember she was a buyer for Merkel's.
Oh,
and I
very
think
well.
she realized I had sales resistance. And she called me up in the morning, said, you know, you've got a job. And I thought, oh, and you know, she said, you just got to go see Francis Broderick. So I went to see Francis Broderick. Beforehand, though, I had attempted to substitute. And every time you get all gussied up, the young gal would get it, you know, and I was too old and so forth. And I accepted it, and I had a little change. If I lived carefully, I went to the library, and I would research in special collections and then come home and transpose families. And I thought, well, that's great. That's an office. I'll finish my old Beekman Town. But at the same time, I kind of scolded myself. You know, sometimes before you go, it's like the cat going through the door. You make sure your tail gets in there. I was scolding myself to not say anything wrong, you know, or how do we do this so it'd be all right. And so, okay, I just admonished myself just to be careful. And so Francis Broderick said to me, now, Mrs. Shields, you don't have to, you can come 1 hour a day, just 1 hour a day. And I thought, how can I tell this man that? So I did. I said, well, Mr. Broderick, you can't take a car and go anywhere for 1 hour a day. And gasoline was 53 cents a gallon at the time. Okay, how I got this job, I never dreamt. And so it was over. I had the little Bob Long's little office over in the Surrogate in that nice little old first building. It was built in 1886. And I know I shivered there because, you know, the press will quarter and core you with a blowtorch. They will really fix you. And I was scared to death. I really was. And I called Francis Broderick and I said, you know, I'm absolutely frightened here. Well, he said, relax. But we had all the files were on the floor, so I got after it, and I think the salary was, I don't know, $2,500 at the time. And so we had snowy days, and it was all right. I could stay at home. And so I every time I'd come back, I would bring my letters to Francis because they put them through the post office. And by the end of April, I had done 190 letters. And Jim Sears was the supervisor at the time, the chairman of the Board of Legislature. And I said to Jim, I said, you know, I've earned my salary right now in 3 months' time. He said, look, girl, you took the job, you work it. So I have.
So what year was that when you first did it?
78. In 78. And really I thought, you know, everybody, when they take a job, you have a little promise to yourself. And I thought, well, boy, I can work that too, and I can get my old Beekman Town done. I will tell you what happened, though. This area, this Clinton County, as you think of it, it is in the northeastern corner of New York State. It is bordered by the lake. It was settled following the Revolution, the American Revolution, and as people came here to settle, it's in a wave of westward migration on the way over to St. Lawrence County, you know, across the top of the state. And in those days, when people were coming in a flat scow, and when they brought very little with them, and they stopped a while, they walked a lot of it, and when they stopped a while, some of their people were buried here and so forth, and some of them were married here, so that as time goes on, especially this last 20 years, we have been in the pathway of genealogy seekers, and irrespective. This office, okay, so when I first came, there were 212 books, and as time went on, partly through gratitude and partly through purchasing, because we do have a small budget, there are better than 3,000. And some of our books are
From 212?
From 212,
Wow.
and a part of those were the McClellan collection, because, you know, when you go in any office, you can see who did what. And our great gal was Margaret Hayes, and there's some wonderful things in there. Every now and then I find something of hers and say, golly, I didn't know that gal did this. She did a wonderful story of the canals. And then there was Jack Stewart. And Jack Stewart was a great person, and Steve Riley, very outstanding, because when you look in the files, you can find their stuff. And Jack Stewart is the person that when we had the centennial, and in 76, and Mr. McClellan allowed Plattsburgh Public Library to copy the McClellan cemetery records. Jack Stewart that next year copied them here. And you do realize that the McClellans worked for 30 years copying cemeteries. Now they had a reason for doing that. I do believe that, and I think the year is documented, 1888, they had a fire up there, and that's where Clark's funeral home is, and then Mr. McClellan redid that building. One of the sorrows in his life, and he's never really told me that, but as you look at what McClellan did, I feel that fire impacted him, because he lost the early church records. He was a trustee or a deacon in the church, and he also served in the town. He lost some of the town records, and I do believe that if you go up to Champlain right now, the town records, isn't it 98, they do not start in 1880. The New York State mandate is 80, but Champlain is later, and a part of it is because some of them were lost in that fire. But, so, in their spare time, old Hugh and Charles Woodbury, and then they involved Holden. She used to laugh about how she got involved in having to go with them, and they copied from cemetery stones. They copied 153 cemeteries. Now, they did not do what's the south side of, the west side of South Catherine. They did not do St. Peter's nor St. John's that's over there, nor the Jewish, because those churches had good records and those cemeteries are so terribly large. But they copied all the little ones. And right now, there is a sorrow in that 1/3 of those cemeteries are abandoned. Now, the town of Chazy has taken care of those. And it's interesting, Mr. Maynard up in Champlain does Glenwood. Different people have dedications. Lois R. When Lois R. died, Lois R. brought up all the cemeteries up to time. You think of 1966, so we're in 98. So our cemetery records failed to have the last 30 years unless somebody brought them up to time. Lois R. did, and Carol Netto has those records right now. But
it's wonderful to talk about the cemeteries, what ties history together, what kinds of things make up history, and how do we preserve it so that people today can come and study it. I want to continue our interview with Addie Shields, the Clinton County historian, in just a moment. You know, two things, Addie, that Calvin mentioned. First of all, I think you were talking about a different road. You said
yes, that's the
you said
Stratton
the
Hill
Slauson
Road.
Road, but you
Yeah.
meant the Stratton Hill Road. That's very significant because people are
The
going to rush up
elevation
there to
is
take
there, yeah.
that ride and see what they
Yeah.
can see,
Yeah.
and they won't be seeing Isle of Mott.
You know, and it was Nell Sullivan too who remarked that used to be higher than it is now, and I can see that erosion may have its slighter elevation than it was previously. The other place that's similar to that is up here where the Cateville Expressway is, where that myriad of lights are. To the northwest, to the southwest of that is the wonderful quarry that's up there. But in some of our documentation, we have the fact where the jail is the old McCready place, where the sheriff's office is now. And it is recorded that at the time, the McCrady's had a sugar bush right there between the McCrady's and the Smiths, and they didn't realize that there was all that strata of limestone rock underneath, which became exposed with time and erosion and what man does to it and so forth. But yes, I made a mistake. That was the
Stratton Hill.
Stratton Hill Road. Now, the other point we wanted to make was to make sure that our younger audience, and hopefully we have a lot of young people that we can inspire today towards studying history, may have no clue as to what Francis Broderick's job was here in Clinton County
yes.
when you were hired. So explain that.
Well, first, was Lauren Brooks. Lauren Brooks was the wonderful person who recorded and kept records for this county, and then Francis Broderick was the clerk, and then there was an interim person, and then our Mr. Bingle.
Who is the administrator for Clinton County now?
Right, when it changed from supervisoryship to the legislature, okay, with the redistricting that went on. The other bit, too, is, so who is Mr. McClellan? Alan Everest did that very nice book on the Moors. And the first Plenty Moor was down at the time of the war, wait a minute now, the American Revolutionary War, when in 1781 they had a Soldiers' Bounty Act, whereby the poor little New York State that was, they were struggling, and the people who lived there, take the people down on the Hudson that worked for the Livingstons, they were watching it, and they did not want to sign in with the revolutionaries. If England won, they wanted to be able to get land from England, and if the states won, so they wanted the land that the states would offer, so they were just watching this, and they didn't sign on. And New York State, in April of that year, came through with the fact that if you would sign on with us and fight against Great Britain, we will give you land relative to the number of days you served and the strata, the level that you came to. Okay. And Plenty More, when in that fall, in 1781, Cornwallis was defeated, and then 1783, the Treaty of Paris. And when the soldiers were being, when they were being disbanded and so forth, it was Plenty More that had a certain position, paymaster, something like this. And his father, Alan Everest remarks in that book that his father was saying to him, get as many of those certificates as you can. See? He was telling that kid, don't you waste your money, you swing that. Because there are some of those soldiers, you see, that didn't want land, didn't want to come way up here in the wilderness. And so that is where they accumulated some of the extra certificates, that's not the word for it either, for the privilege of swapping that off for bounty land, which New York State would give them up here to the north. And then, of course, plenty more came, and McClellan is a descendant of that. And McClellan is one of the individuals involved in the architecture of our Samuel Champlain Monument. And there are several buildings that he built, not here, but in various other areas. And when he came here to Champlain in retirement, you know, people had to have something to do, and that was mentally his line. He could record, and he saw the need of it, because, you know, there's always trauma with a funeral, and somebody does that work for you and takes care of that displacement earth, and then you've got to fill it up afterwards, and you know, there's all these tears and sorrow, and the man that did all that shoveling, you know, he just went home and wiped his brow and had some porridge, and who wrote down anything? You see? Who wrote down anything? And Woody McClellan saw that, or old Hugh did, and then involved his son. And now wait a minute. So after he allowed the Plattsburgh Public to copy those, Jack Stewart copied them from here. And incidentally, Jack Stewart's quite a genealogist and quite a historian. He hasn't missed very much, and what he's missed, he dug out. You know, he's had that way of finding the right sources. You know, because documentation is where it's written, unless you're reading the landscape. Even if you read where the old road was, it is all of the equipment really wrote on that geography, didn't it? If you want to read the landscape where an old piece of road was. All right, so. The thing that I did when I was here, because I am responsible for leadership with 14 towns and 4 villages, and we have people all in each of the areas working, and they needed their copy of the cemetery records, and so we copied their segment, and I've asked every one of them that when they copy off a sheet of those, that they put the word McClellan under them, because if you work for 30 years copying cemetery records in the brambles and the rose bushes and the nettles and the whatever, that's right. Now, poison ivy, you'd want some credit for it. Okay, now when the McClellans died, those originals were given up to the college, the special collections, and they are there. Plus, now there are records north of the border. They copied those, but Protestant ones. And there's a great deal of the area north of the border that's UEI, that's Protestant people, Scotch, and so forth. And however, the Catholic ones have all been made into repertoires. Now, there is a gentleman, he was a fertilizer salesman, Mr. Pobriand, and he came here and he had done 105 repertoires of the early Catholic churches along the Richelieu River in Quebec. And he came down here, he had asked Bishop Berzana was the bishop at that time, for the privilege of copying the records, and he allowed him to copy them up to 80, and then he alphabetized them and made a repertoire, so that it's like going to a dictionary, if you know who your father and mother was, who got married, and the parents would be in there too. So at the present time, well, he started, of course, with St. Joseph's in Champlain, and yes, it's Coopersville, because that's our first church. So we have all of those records, and the thing that's happened in this office is, you know, it zeroes in on Clinton County. It's been our focus, it's what we needed to do, and I am guilty of we had a CETA person here, and because I wanted to do my old Beekmantown book, I had that young man, and he really was patient. He didn't find fault, he was so happy, he'd been on welfare, and he was thrilled. He sat right there with the microfilm reel, and he had the reel, the 1850, the 1860, and he copied, you know, he transposed it to the written page. It's the greatest thing, you can run your finger down. And so that started me to make every one of the towns, starting with their charter, and you'll see them on the wall. There's 14 black books out there in which we have, for the time when a town was erected, and as much as we can find about that town, so that anybody could come and use them and have a little history of it, okay? And we continue that too.
Yeah, now with the age of the computer and people getting into the genealogy of their own families, you must have more requests for information than you can almost handle sometimes.
Well, Okay, now that's very true. That's very true. And way back when Mr. Pontbriand came, there was an individual by the name of Marquis. And because we had so much here, and you almost can't do it, because people will, you may have somebody here, but about 2:45, or 3:15, or 4:45, somebody will come. They flew into Logan, they got a car, they drove over here, they went walking through the cemetery, they couldn't find what they wanted, they started asking questions. Somebody said, well, go to the county. They come here, but they got to fly out tomorrow morning. So you're involved through 6 o'clock into 7 and so forth?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
But
that's what you do. But that's not what the point I'm trying to make is. It's not a 3-day-a-week job.
no, this is true.
You've
All right,
made
so
it your entire life, your passion.
when Marquis was here, because we needed to take the load off this office, it was one of the reasons why I signed in with Marquis, and I am charter member number 4 in the Northern New York American Canadian, because since this is in the pathway of the British, the French people who the old seigneur in the north, wait a minute, the custom of Paris in 1630, I think it is, in which they set up the division of land up there into seigneuries, and those seigneuries were divided 1/3 for the old seigneur, 1/3 for the priest, the other third for the habitant who was going to cultivate all of that. He had to earn the living for all of that, but he had 12 kids, and his 12 kids had 12 kids, 144, the square root. So that, and you do know that in Canada you can't go to the north. You can for pleasure, but you better have your provisions with you and a way to get out. The American dream in Canada has to go to the south, and so with the influx of people who came down the Richelieu for settlement here, and you would find that in northern Vermont and in here, a young man in the 1820s or 30s and 40s would come down and maybe sleep up in the garret for his clothes and his keep, and maybe a very little bit of cash in the wintertime, but take his cash home. There's something else about Canada. The Roman Catholic religion on the North American continent, you have to remember that it was started, you talk about Plymouth, and those were people from England, remember, and they came because of religious persecution. And there have been all these problems in religion between the Catholics and the Protestants. All right. And when you come to the States, you remember that Maryland had Baltimore and Maryland, Lord Calvert, and the war they had there, and the loser went to Philadelphia. Philadelphia has always been it's the key, it's the friendly state, what's the word, brotherly love, and therefore one of the first Catholic churches was in Philadelphia. And because we were intolerant, the people that came to Massachusetts, you remember they were intolerant? That's why Hooker moved down, you remember? And left Massachusetts and so forth. All right. When we as rebels were leaving, when the Boston Massacre was on, the British Parliament played politics with the Roman Catholic Church, with the priests up there. And they passed, in 1774, they passed the Quebec Act, which made the Roman Catholic Church legal. And therefore, when Moses Hazen had been cutting timbers, because we had trees that were 125 foot high and 6 to 8 foot on the base for masts and so forth, and when that group of people were cutting timber, he had all these Frenchmen down here cutting timber, and then there was this problem, and Moses Hazen had problem with England, but we were at war, and he was able to become and create Congress's own regiment, and he involved those Catholic people to come down here with him, but the priests put them in the books. They were absent with the rebels, and therefore they could not go home. And so they could not go home. All right. And so in 1786, one of the first things we did when our new little government in New York State came together was create a federal land office and give the Nova Scotian land tract, the Canadian Nova Scotian land tract, to pay those refugees, because now So they were done, they were back here in 83. And they had been served by the priest down there in Philadelphia, at St. Joseph's of Philadelphia. In fact, that priest had gone to them who were ill, and there are some of the Canadian records down there because of the priest tending to him. And he wrote it in his book. All right, and then when they settled in that nice land in Chazy Landing in Frenchman's Bay where Trombley's cemetery is, but you know that right off the point over there is Point of Fur. And remember that the British kept troops there until 1795. And our first Secretary of State was John Jay. And the only thing that John Jay really did that he's noted for is making a deal with England, to pull the troops off of there and pull them off from Fort Niagara and off in Oswego. And then when those troops were pulled off there in 1795, then the refugees were safe there. But because that waterway, St. Lawrence River, Richelieu, Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River, that straight cut off, you realize how that cuts off the New England states. And of course that was the intention, that was why it was war. Well, when this was over with, even the War of 1812, it really wasn't safe. And so even Burlington doesn't have a church until 1828 when it's safe. And we didn't have that church. The missionary came down there, but he took his records back, and then they had a fire of that church, so that by 1843 you got records at St. Joseph's in Coopersville, you see, and they were having that land that had been given to them, the Canadian Nova Scotian refugee tract. But you know, when that land was given, I've seen something, and we ought to, can we move up at that? No, you probably can't.
We can move, and sure, we can get up and move anytime we want to. I want to mention that while we're sitting in the other room and Addie was speaking, she was looking up into the sky as if in a dreamlike state, but actually she was pointing at a map across the hall, across the room, and she wanted us to move into another room to show us more maps. She got wonderful maps here. First of all, Addie, what's this one over here that we're looking at?
Okay, this is, of course, the very later map that was made in the 1940s, but what I want you to see in this, because we're talking about the British. See, I have this to show people. This is the British being here at Point of Fur, and they were there until 1905 when John Jay, in John Jay's treaty. The other thing you ought to know about Clinton County is how narrow the lake plain is.
You meant 1805, right? Didn't you say they were there till 1905? You meant 1805.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I just want to clear that up.
And you notice by contrast, our lake plain is very narrow, whereas Burlington's is very broad. All right. But at the same time, here is where they settled, right in here, which is where they had been in this wonderful land. And the British would, if they had a haystack, they'd come and burn them. And there are letters down in Newburgh, because our government was down there saying, please, you promised us land. Our people, are lacking both in food and so forth. And you can just figure that those Canadians knew how to kill deer and coon and were surviving with what they could. All right. So, the new little government, 1786, the Land Office, set up this Canadian Nova Scotian refugee tract. All right, now the best land is right here. You follow out of that? There's something been happening, you see, because Platt had been working here, and Platt got this part right here. Beekman had this before. You do realize the Beekman's got that as that's Beekman patent known as a colonial grant, because it was granted by the colony of New York. Whereas, and they had first made a lot of money with the land down in Poughkeepsie that's known as Beekman's, but this was their second. But it became so far, it was given in 1769, and it was so far from New York City, it was difficult to police, and they had wonderful timber on it. And see how Beekmantown thrusts out here, and it was right on the route. The route is off of here. However, Mr. Platt was busy too, so he had this. He worked for other people, and something happened when they gave him this. I want to show you something. This is Denimore Mountain. This has a tendency to be sandy. There's waterfalls there and so forth. There was timber. But what actually happened is most of the Nova Scotian people kept this refugee patent right here. And can you see why? This is the good land. You could raise radishes on any of it, you know, garden ground. And of course, the real truth of it is that to a great extent, there's a part in here at Altona where you have the glaciation removed the good soil and so forth. So that when Mr. Pliny Moore recorded this, Pliny himself said that the refugees swapped off a great deal of this for a sack of flour, a bolt of cloth, or tobacco. Is that right? But and you have to see that it's what was left by the time they got this. It was what was left. See, nobody wanted Denimore Mountain at that time. They were big-hearted. They were big-hearted.
It's good to see it on a map like that because you can get the idea. I never knew why they called it the refugee patent until you just told me.
Well,
So
those men had fought all the way to Yorktown, and they had been promised, and so, and you stop and think, so when Yorktown was over, and our little government was, so who wanted to take responsibility for anything? How'd those people get back here? Well, I don't know. They walked and they got rides on boats and so forth, and who did this? There's very little recording in this area. I guess you could find it in the Albany or I'm not sure. I just don't know where.
This is an old map of Clinton County over here.
That's the Burr. That's the Burr, and that merely has the trails on it.
What year would that date to now? 1840. Huh?
Yes, but Burr did 3 maps, 1835, 40, and 45. Now, I'm glad that you're looking at that because you do realize that when the Custom of Paris laid out the seigneuries, they laid them out long and narrow. Everybody had 4 miles of lakefront and 9 miles inland. And can you see that Beekman Town has inherited from the old Custom of Paris and the seigneuries, the rangs? See that? You notice when you go to Montreal, you look as if you're traveling, you know, and you're looking at the scenery. There's all those line fences, and they all go down. They all go one way. See, and then the thought was, so everybody had some, they owned some parts so they could fish here because people lived off from what they could fish, and so good land. But as you go west in this, you're going into glacial till because, of course, our inheritance from the Wisconsin Glacier. You do realize that right now, if you go back out Canada Street and you go up 3, and you're getting up there to the lights where you come off the Northway, if you're in the Cardinal bus up there and you stop waiting for the lights, you're looking down, down, down to the sea. It's just as if you were in Boston, and you're going over the old beaches of the Champlain Sea.
It's interesting to think about it that way, and you put it in perspective for us.
Our inheritance from France? Yep.
Yeah.
Just and that was the Gautier tract. And so it's the Gautier tract. And it was when, well, you know, the Anglophone-Francophone situation has been true for a long time. The French lost dearly in 1759 with the defeat, you know, with Wolfe and Montcalm. And I do believe that the land was devastated up there. They cut the pear trees and they burned the wheat fields, and the French people that were left retreated all the way down to Montreal, and there isn't a lot of, I'm not sure what there is in records, but remember, they owned all the Mississippi River Valley, and how much that must have hurt the French. In fact, somebody called me from Florida the other night, Mr. Brown, and he was saying to me, well, he'd done a lot of work, and he was touching base, and so he said, my old great-great-great-grandfather was a bailiff in Montreal in 1755, and see, then they got down here, and they were entry-level people. Well, and he wanted to know why. Well, I can see why. When Great Britain conquered the French over here, that bailiff didn't have a job anymore. She, in time, substituted a good Scotchman or an Englishman, and if he had any money in French, whatever, what happened to the devaluation of money? I don't know, but you can see that they were conquered, and they felt very badly at being conquered, didn't they?
All right, let's move over here a little bit. I want to see this beautiful map too. Let's get over here so we can get a picture of it.
If you go to the library, you will see, if you will go over to Shirley Kester's at Clinton County Historical Society, hers is a white one. Hers is the white one. This has been varnished. This was Bob Feinberg's. And Bob Feinberg gave this to Gary Desautels, and this map belongs to Gary. It's on loan to me. And I think probably it was the intention of Mr. Feinberg that we'd go to special collections. But Gary Desautels' father worked for, Ben Feinberg owned Clinton Press. Remember down there where Lawless has an office and the post office is? And this became Gary's father's. And there again, can you see that rang there, that Signori? See it? See? And now Peru kind of has inherited that too. See how long and narrow it is? Yes, I got my stuff.
Yeah, get back out of there. I don't want to see you trapped over in the corner somewhere. But it's great to look at a map like this because this is history too. The buildings on here. State prison at Dannemora. We're talking 1856 here.
Now maybe he would like to, maybe we can push this.
No, that's all right. He can see it just fine. There's a little glare we might mention. There's some plastic on the front of it.
Actually, when people are searching, they start where they are and they go backwards. And they go back. We have downstairs the 1892, the 1905, 15, and those are New York State censuses. Those are in open ledger form. We also have, starting with, the most serviceable ones start with 1850 because they enumerate all the children. All right, so taking the microfilm by the United States federal government starts in 1850. You've got a family in 1850. If you can find them on here in 1856, it gives you a picture where they are. And then you've got 1860. And then you've got the 1869 Beers map that was done after the Civil War. And you realize the cartographers during the Civil War, they mapped all the battles. And afterwards, they came north. And their Beers Atlas is the Bible. In fact, the background of that is taken from the Beers, other than the Gores have been added to that.
Fascinating. Now, you have so many other things in this room. I'm trying to get an idea for our viewers what they might be able to do when they come in here. Why you've given us an indication why some people come in to see the historian. They're looking for an old grave site, looking for information about their family.
You know what I say to them? We had a couple doctors came here and they had 2 black books and everything was under plastic and they didn't have one source. And of course, because of their status, I was very, very careful. I didn't realize it at first. And I asked, where'd you get that? And they did not have their sources. And that taught me something. It was a very long time ago. Now, I'm not sure what those people ever did with their affairs. But anybody that comes here, I like to start with them, and I want them to love whoever they are trying to find, and I want them to know the history of their people. What sort of a situation were they living in? And for instance, take St. Joseph's at Corbeau. Take the priest that was there when Pontbriand was here, and Pontbriand had all the church records from St. Peter's and St. John and so forth, and he said, as he worked with those records, that he could read into there that the cold country, probably the lack of ink or frozen ink, and in the lack of heat, and what a tremendous situation people were working in when they were recording, when they were trying to write down. And incidentally, I look at St. John's. When Montreal subsidized that St. Peter's Church over there, and you realize how they build that when the French were entry level, and the French were entry level for a very long time in this area. It was very difficult to buy a piece of land. You had to wait a long time before they had money enough to do it, and you had to be in somebody's good graces. But when
we took a little break there and put a new battery in the machine and got started again. Addie, you were talking about the churches and how difficult it was for the French to come out down here and get the churches built.
The other thing that happened in the French when they came down here, you want to remember that the French may have been, think about it, the Papineau Rebellion and so forth, they may have been trying to avoid the English. You think about that. They really, and when they came here, however, I think they were happy with with a little more lucrative money than they may have had there, more opportunities because we were the American dream. But one of the things in the French language is, they may not have noticed it at first, but they were in an Anglican setting. They were with Anglican people, and so the French names, the Pelcher became Pelkey, you follow? And so I sometimes speak of it as Yankee garble, how the names were, and how much we
that
have,
does describe it, doesn't it?
how we have flattened out the language. One of the things, though, that I read in the churches is, now St. Peter's has wonderful records, please God, when they started that, and so does St. Joseph's of Corbeau. St. Joseph's of Corbeau being the first, and then it is John Bilo, who, when he was up in Quebec, he found a letter which was written by Father Michaud, and he was writing to the Archbishop, who at that time was down in Albany, and he was saying, I came down to the mouth of Saranac, and there I found many French. I baptized 87, but I was just going through. Can you see, the man was all alone? But those baptisms are gone. You follow?
Yeah, sure.
All right. And so the French here had a hard time until Montreal, I believe, must have subsidized them somewhat in the building of that church. And when it comes to records, then with the church and having a place for the pastor to live, a parish house, in 1857 he went out and took records. The priest took records of all of his parishioners, and he listed the women's names, and that, so it was very important. Before the 1850 census, the United States Census does not care what the wife's name, her last name was.
Isn't that amazing?
And then, so in 1867, the priest took another census, and both of those are wonderful in that they come in those odd years. Now, when you look at St. John's, though, now both these were together down at the mouth of St. John's Church has the pictures of the old stores that they rented and so forth. And you want to remember, you don't get pictures until probably about the time of the Civil War, because photography started in 1835, and the impact of the Civil War, the pictures of the boys and so forth, and afterwards in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But come back to St. John's records. Just wonderful. So the parish priest from St. John's, even after the French had their St. Peter's, St. John's was continuing. They were the Irish, and they went down to Keysville and so forth. And there's one place in there. Now, it's in 1833, and I use it as an example. And the priest had baptized about 5 children, and when he came to the 5th, and and it was Mary something, and then he said, I do not recollect. See, these people worked alone with no help, and how difficult it was. And so
it's pretty hard to put the history together when you don't know the last Mary something. I don't recollect. Huh?
I do not recollect, and we just love that passage because it shows, it's the interpretation. And to come back to the people who search, I ask them, please, to try along with their search, because if you just search one name and another, that's useless. Some people on the computer, they'll send me something to unpuzzle, and it's all folded up, you could snap it, go way out in the hall, and the other part is they didn't ink their machine, you almost can't read it, and so I want people to do this because they love the people who were here before them, and they need to know the circumstances they were living in, and that ties them into New York State history and into world history, which is what they should be doing for the culture of the people and so forth.
It's not just a matter of going through the academic process of finding out who your ancestors were. It's having a passion for them as people.
Good for you.
And I think if there's one thing that you've proved to us so far in an interview today, you try to feel what they were feeling. You stand on a piece of land and try to imagine precisely what the weather was like on a fall day when they made a decision. Was there ever another ice storm such as that terrible ice storm we had? We were discussing before how it improved our vision.
You do realize that the nunnery that was on, what's the island, the Grey Nuns Island up in Montreal is island, and they have records. And isn't it about in the 1640s that we had a tremendous earthquake, and that some of our upthrusts date back to that 1640, and it is the nuns who recorded that? And we look at our landscape, you know, our Spellman fault line. Did you ever realize what the first road was out of Plattsburgh to the north? Well, it was up there on the Spellman fault line in front of Joe Giroux's, right straight up. You follow? Because if you're going to have a team, if you do not put your feet in the mud and have to pull them out every time, you try to find some high land to walk on, don't you?
And something else we're talking about that I think is significant off camera, so I'm going to talk about it on camera, is the difficulty in travel. As we were looking up on the maps and you talked of water travel, of course, that's where the commerce was. And the minute you try to go back away from the lake and head in that direction, it took a long time to get somewhere because you were battling some pretty dense wilderness.
That's right. The other bit...
Especially heading up the mountainous area like Dannemora.
Yes. All right. And so when it comes to water traffic, and these people had settled here, remember they came up here by boat from the south, from the along the Hudson River, because at the time, at the end of the American Revolution, the settlement was along the Hudson, along the Mohawk, and Clinton County has a commonality with Oneida County. They had Fort Stanwix, and that was a wilderness beyond. And we, above Fort Ticonderoga, we were in Crown Point and Westport, we were almost a wilderness, and this is the land that was being given away. All right, when it comes to land, we ought to also talk about that Saranac River. Now, our Saranac River was not navigable, but it did have the wonderful timber on either side of it. And that timber, the story of Clinton County is the movement of the timber line, because all of the boats in the water business were wooden bottoms. They were wooden bottoms, and you had to have good planks, and therefore, by 1850, we had cut and settled about 10 miles inland, with the exception of the river. And in 1850, there were two things that happened. They built the plank road, and then they also had legislation whereby if you were bringing timber down here, and you lived on this side, and I lived over here, I could not obstruct you. They made it a common waterway. Those two things in 1850. Now, there's one reason why the plank road, we are told, went bankrupt. And then I see a little mention there. They said they bought the timber from Canada. And I asked myself what kind of businessman would be buying, because if you were going up here, you could start up here and you could, if you were laying a road, you'd get the timber right beside it to put in a mud hole, wouldn't you? And I always felt that is why they went bankrupt, because they bought their timber from the wrong place. Maybe I'm wrong.
That's amazing, but you are absolutely correct in pointing out that the timber business was such an essential part of the history. And if you study all the different people that were involved in getting timber down that Saranac River, and who had the first visions of having those log runs down the river, and how they got it to Plattsburgh, and how the bakers and the others in Plattsburgh had those big mills down there at the end of Bridge Street, and how this place was really humming in the 1860s, right up through the 1870s.
Well, yes. You look at that house where Ron Stafford and the lawyers are. That house was built by Christopher Norton, and at the time
former American Legion, Post 20, right?
That's right. And Christopher Norton had a mill where the Imperial is, and during the Civil War, it is recorded. It is not mine. Margie Lansing Porter recorded that he was shipping 4 canal boats of timber out of that Imperial mill every day. He had money enough, and he also got into politics, and he lost the election in 1893, and they foreclosed on him, and that is how Smith Weed got that house, which became, you follow? He was an accompanying lawyer with him.
Pretty nice park across the street there at one point too, wasn't it?
Yes.
Across from that building.
Yes. And
you see the old photographs along the Saranac River, and what a beautiful spot that was.
You realize too that and the automotive age made the city of Plattsburgh, or someone, the Department of Transportation, put what used to be called, what was the bridge there?
The old Humpy, the Smith Weed Bridge.
Yes, all right. And therefore they put some fill there, because otherwise that road that went out of that little walkway that went out of the cellar just went straight across to their park. Yes. The other bit too is that in Steamboat,
we were both here, and we remember when that When the railroad came and removed that bridge, remember the controversy?
Mr. Ransom
Yo,
caught it
boy,
so nicely.
oh boy.
The other thing about this, so it was water transportation. If you wanted to go any place, you went by water. And we had the Saxes, and this is a Germanic influence. And Mr. Saxe, John Saxe had been, I don't know, I think the 9th of children and somebody, all right, and he was alone. And it took him a long time to walk out of Germany to get up to Belgium to sail out and to be, he had to pay it, you know, even if somebody give you a place to sleep in the hay, you had to work for it, so that it took him some time to get out. And they, in order to get out of Europe, he was apprenticed to a sea captain, and that sea captain brought him over to Philadelphia, and there he learned to be bilingual, and he worked in this flour mill and obtained his independence. But one of the errors that he did, he pledged allegiance to Great Britain, and so when the American Revolution came on, even though he had a wife and children, he was thrown the slammer. So at the end of the Revolution, he was allowed out of prison, and so he came north, and he thought he was in Canada because he still believed in Great Britain. These people were rebels, and I suppose if you worked with them, you did have reason not to enjoy them. All right, and so he got over here just north of Burlington, and he developed a mill. And his sons, and you know, kids have to have things to play, and they had all the natural things to play with, and so his sons would go up the river in the summertime. You do realize that in the backwater it'll be dry, hot July and August, and it was red iron, and so those boys going with an old boat would shovel off with a flat shovel. They would shovel that mud that had the iron deposit on it, and they would bring it down, and they puddled it. At the same time, the Wyans, W-Y-A-N-D-S, no, that's not right, that's my good friends in Point Rush. It's W-I-N-A-N-S. The Winans were building by 1809 that steamboat. And whether these people had connections or not, I've talked to Helen Booth because she's a Sax, relative to what books they have, what they had, because. So what did those boys puddle? But I have a notion those boys puddled something that was in demand, something that somebody might be able to get some money out of, and therefore, were they making nails? Were they making chains for that boat? But anyhow, they were smart enough. And you see, this was Indian territory. The roads were Indians. The trails were Indians. Trails, sure they were. And so they were smart enough that they came over here to Chazy Landing. And if you'll notice that Chazy Landing, see the landing right here? Mm-hmm. That straight road takes you way back so that you can hit for the river. The river valley, to take you to St. Lawrence County? Mm-hmm. All right, now, and they threw out a 200-foot dock out there. All right, now when they did that, Plattsburgh still didn't have a dock. And the people who were migrating over, came to Chazy. Now, there was a reason for their coming to Chazy, because this is 1809. They've been, the people here, these settlers, how do you get money? You got money by cutting timber, and you built rafts. And you remember the one I was talking about? There's the nice little mud hole right there, where if you were building a raft, and there's the Reynolds Road, you go right, see, and that's the road that wasn't there at that time. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. All right. Now, in Ingraham, got to find Ingraham. But anyhow, what I want you to know about is that so they, when they, now everybody had been selling their best timber. Now, did you ever see a stand of timber that was all perfect? You got some trash in any. And so they had used over here in Shelburne, they had used the best of their timber, but when they started that 1809, this boat, what was it? It was a steam-propelled boat. Yeah. You got to have wood for it, and so they put on enough wood to last them up here to Chazy Landing. When they got to Chazy Landing, whoops! Here's a way to make some money. You got all that trash wood out there that wasn't timber that you could raft. It wasn't long and straight rifted. So always that steamboat would come up here, get some timber, get some 3-foot wood that you can put in there to make it go putt, 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 putt. It would take them to St. John's, Quebec. They'd come back here and get some more. That was an advantage to Chazy. Do you see that? Now, and so the freight port along here was first here. It was not Plattsburgh, because if you're going to go to Dannemora, you've got to rest those oxen. If you don't rest them, they're got the heaves and they're beside the road. Whereas here, they were avoiding the elevations, weren't they? They were if they landed migrants who might have come from down here in Vermont and wanted to go to St. Lawrence County, they didn't come over here and go west out of Plattsburgh. In the first place, somebody had tried to go that way, and they had remember, it's Sally Baker Saranac's story how in 1802 they had frozen in October trying to go through the mountains. So people remembered that, and so they skirted the elevation of the Adirondacks, and it is Chazy Landing that does it so beautifully. You see? All right, so then they put on some more timber to get back down here, and they absolutely avoided this until 1822. The freight port was up there in Chazy.
That's a good point.
There's some things about Dannemora that's very interesting. And
Now you hold on that thought. Things about Dannemora. We're going to take a little break to get a breather, and we'll be right back with our program. Okay, we got another map. Historians love maps of different time periods. We have a more modern map here because it gives us a little better view of where some of the roads are. We're talking about the Plank Road. We're talking about the railroad across the top of the state over to Ogdensburg and carrying produce, and how we got things to Dannemora, to Lion Mountain. Where you want to start at?
Well, New York State history, our history of Clinton County, fits into New York State history, into United States history. And when you all remember the Northwest Territory in 1787, which laid out Ohio, Indiana, the Great Plains, and as that was getting settled, they raised the produce there. And how are you going to get produce out of the Great Plains? You ship it down the Mississippi, but you might want it over in Boston. And all right, so it could go north into the Great Lakes, and Chicago became a great port. But how are you going to get it to us? By 1835, by 1822 and so forth, and into the 30s, you had our Erie Barge Canal, and you also had the Welland Canal between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, which would bring produce through into our Erie Barge Canal. And then we had a feeder up here. Our Champlain Canal is a feeder. But that would take grain to us, to the Lake Champlain ports, and down the Hudson River. But Bostonian, the concentration of population was over in Bostonian. When you do history in a greater picture. And the people in Boston, how are you going to feed Boston? All right. The Bostonian people were lobbying our New York State government, and by 1838, our New York State legislature passed a law. They appropriated some money for the surveying of a railroad from Ogdensburg to Ross's Point. And why did they put it at Ogdensburg? I didn't know either. Some man came here from Ontario, a wonderful person, researching his grandfather, great-great-grandfather. He said my great-grandfather was a engineer on that railroad, and he was trying to find out about it. And I think I was a little bit ignorant. He said, look, didn't you know that the narrowest part of the St. Lawrence River is between Prescott and Ogdensburg, and that the first railroad built from Ottawa was down to Prescott? And of course that follows common sense. Anybody in Canada looks to the south. And so, all right. And so by 1851, they had that railroad for produce. And you think about grain from the Great Plains up through the Welland Canal into Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And yes, it could go across that Erie Barge Canal, but how are you going to get to Boston? So if they brought it up here to this railroad, the building of that railroad pulled the cork out of the bottleneck that was grain in the Midwest to carry it to Boston. You took it to Ross's Point and then went across the bridge. And you do know that there was a train south in Vermont earlier than here. Yes, it did come down to Plattsburgh in 1853, but because we got 5 mountain ranges south of Plattsburgh, the train never went out of Plattsburgh until 1875 to go south. All right, now, so you got that railroad. It also ties in with your lighthouses. You got your lighthouses. The very fact of building that train is why you have lighthouses over here. Okay, and in the same time frame, and in as much as we just did that marker for Lucy Hobbs Taylor up in Ellenburg. Now, Lucy Hobbs Taylor was born in 1833, and you think if she had been born 10 or 20 years earlier, she probably would have lived her life up there. But when she was 18 years old, and when she was a little girl, when she was getting to be 13, 14, 15, in those days you knew what was going on, you didn't have television to create all the nonsense to take your mind away. All right, that railroad took her to the Midwest. Can you see that? When she was 18 years old, there was an advantage. You could go to the Midwest. You did not have to go to the center of population along the Atlantic seaboard. That was all taken up. The adventure was gone there. The adventure was to the west. And so Lucy Hobbs Taylor went to the west. It ties in with that railroad. The railroad did something else. When you look at Dannemora Prison was put up there in 1845. It was done by the state of New York. And they had two other prisons down in Sing Sing and one over in, oh dear, starts with O. And, but they needed another one. But at the same time, a prison is a tremendous expense, and they wanted it to make some money. All right, so in 1845, they put that prison up there because they knew there was iron deposits. But you got a problem, and if you look at that map, see the distance here, and you know that when you go here, we take the Katyville Expressway and we go over that wonderful, it's kind of plains land, it's rolling, you're gaining elevation all the time, it's over glacial till and so forth, and then you start to climb. And oh my goodness, you climb. And if you were taking produce, barrels of flour, you got to feed those men. You put them up there. And they were supposed to earn by puddling the iron and so forth. They were supposed to be able to sell that iron and make enough money to buy the flour to get up there to feed them and so forth. But if you're going to put Mr. Larkin and many people from the area would have a team, and they they made agreements, what's the word for them, in which they would carry the flour up there to them. But you had to stop and rest your horses, or if they were oxen, you got to rest them. And they go a little ways further, you got to rest them. And did you ever start a load that you stopped? If you got a load, the thing to do is keep it going. You stop it, and it takes, remember that business in physics, it takes twice as much? All right, so something else happened. Now, you know, people sit quietly, but they knew their geography. We don't know our geography. You know, little kids see all of this. In fact, I have a little friend we take all these roads off it and have it just a geography map, and then you can do something with it. And you can get back in time with just a geography map. All right, these people that were up there, they knew from the Indian trails, they knew the lay of the land, they knew that the slope of the Adirondacks went to the north, they knew that the last foothills were up here in Ellenburg, and that railroad train went across there. And there is that, they built a road. And Steve Petrashun and myself have been trying to really figure it out so that we would be correct, you know. They built it right on the surveyed line, and of course when you go through here, see all those little rivulets? So there's swampy land in there and wetland, and so they corduroyed that. And they went right up there, and they used to call this area up here Dannemora Station. So when that grain came from the Midwest, whoops, you could unload it there, and they had the horses and the wagons, and there are people in the Ellenburg book, they quote someone who remembers that and remembers the horses, the teams of horses with the big flatbeds, the sleighs in the winter and the wheels in the summertime, the old hard wooden wheels with rings around them that were steel, you know, the steel tired, all right, and that would load up and bring that flour back up here and over to Dannemora, which was easier on the horses once they put the bark in here and made a corduroy road in here. Yep. Now, there's something else that happened too. So with the Civil War, all of the surface deposits of iron were used, wonderful iron here, and they cut off the timber because if you've got to puddle that iron and make it into pigs and so forth, and it was the equal of Swedish iron, but they exhausted it during the Civil War. And after that, over there in Standish. There's an old 81, and I went up there with Mr. Healy, a wonderful, where it was almost a surface mine. But by 1868, they were into Lion Mountain, and therefore, by 1868, they were into Lion Mountain. They didn't have a railroad train up there until 1879. So this plank road in Denimore Station and that railroad across carried a lot of freight. Can you see that it would carry a lot of freight? It carried freight for whatever was used here, but especially from Denimore. And that freight was grain to a great extent. And then when it got over here, of course, crossed the bridge into Boston, and the Boston, New England states had wonderful connections with railroads before we did, and therefore it was the answer to their prayer, and it carried out. Now, however, where do we go from there?
Well, I'll tell you what I want to talk about next. It's a subject that has fascinated me since I first moved here, and you brought us right up to that point in time, where when you had all this iron mining, when you had all this timber business, you had a lot of little communities built up along the roads and along the rivers, and they don't exist anymore per se, except in our perception of history. And those communities are we call ghost towns, not because they contain ghosts, although we believe that they have the ghosts of all this wonderful industry and residences from way back when, but because the communities moved away to wherever the commerce was at the time. So we have places like Gougeville and Elsinore and New Sweden and Russia
and Woods Falls
and Woods Falls, and places that don't really exist anymore, except if you want to go do a little spelunking and go up there and with a metal detector, as I did with my large family because we couldn't afford real vacations, and go looking around, and you find an old can or bottle or an old dump or a stagecoach step or an old nail, and this is a fascinating part of our history. And more than almost any county in New York State, we have a tremendous amount of those towns that don't exist anymore.
Okay. Actually, the history of Clinton County is the movement of the timberline, and the Rogers are a part of that. They're a perfect example of it. And as we talked, Christopher Norton was moving 4 canal boats off from the mill where the Imperial is every day during the Civil War, and slowly the timber was being exhausted. But you want to remember, unless you got cattle in there to gnaw it down, your trees keep coming back up. And the Rogers are a perfect example of that when they had cut the timber up in here, eventually by the 1890s they were getting into paper products, into pulp, because that's what they had, was 4 and 5 and 6 inch stuff. All right, now when you're talking about the ghost towns, you have to know your United States history too, and you have to know about Cleveland and the fact that he did not continue the tariff. And my grandfather's great uncles, you see the Woods, the Lawrences in the Woods, where I'm Addie Lawrence, and the Lawrences in the Woods were into, and up here at Woods Falls, you notice that, and there's so many things that ties together. Altona didn't have a church. The church was up there in 1861. It was St. Anne's in Morris Forks, and Woods Falls is very close to Morris Forks, and Altona, to have Sacred Heart, Holy Angels at Altona, they didn't have that until about 1908 because of the fact that Woods Falls was it, and that St. Anne's was very well established, and the money in the church was there. Then the other bit. All right, now we have some letters of Amasa Woods in which you could almost hear the tears in it, because he only had one fire forge going. He had to let the others go out. He almost didn't have money enough to pay all his help because the iron from Europe was coming in and was being sold cheaper than his, and he couldn't sell his. And that's what created all the ghost towns. And one of them, the Disco, that's down there just a little north of I don't know, where is it? It's in
Blackbrook, not far from Peasleyville.
Yes, but okay. So Disco was a real place, and what I learned about Disco was a Marie Pierce who came here, who was searching her people, and she went on to tell me that now you got to have money. You spend 5 cents, you got to have another one. All right, you can't you can't get it all out of the woods. You know, you can eat venison and coon, and you can you can make yourself some moccasins, and you can cut your own wood, but you've got to have a little extra cash and so forth. And these people, the railroads gave them an avenue for conveyance, for letters, and one letter would cover a lot of people. And somehow or other, the Discos went to Connecticut, and about that time, trade with China was starting, and the Discos have in Connecticut, somewhere down there on the ocean, the Discos that were up there in Disco have a wonderful trading company, and it is still going. And its function was with China, and that's the time that the motifs from China came back to us and so forth. But your Cleveland's tariff, the failure of Cleveland to inaugurate that tariff is what created all of those ghost towns, with the exception that probably, if it was a businessman to look at it, it was costing them too much to produce. They'd cut off the timber. It was having to be hauled too far. Can you see what I mean? Now, in Altona, there's that wonderful Vassar Road. Vassar Road here. Altona. Well, anyhow, going up from the miners, up here you go, with the Barnaby. See, and see, this is miners in here. This is the center part, you know, where the dam is and where Mr. Gooley did that nice story. You go up that Vassar Road, and there's a big red brick house there, and it's got 2 doors. Now, you know, it's probably a story and a half. Maybe it is a full 2 stories. But the story is that Vassar came from Maine. And see, he understood, and you're about 10, 11, 12 miles inland as the crow would fly. And they were cutting off this timber because some work I did for Arms over here in Chazy. Arms, he was cutting on lot, I think it was 113 or something like this. But that was about in 1810 and so forth. Well, Vassar came there, and at that time, up here in Scioto, you had the bedstead factory, and all that timber had to be hauled to that steam mill, you know, the mill that was at Angelville and then was moved down to where Ray Deso lives and so forth. It all fits.
It all ties in together. Things are a lot different than they were, but it behooves us all to understand these little pieces of history so that we know where we are today and where we might go in the future. I've said it so many times. There are so many treasures in here, and Addie Shields is one of them. But there are so many. I look at these wonderful old books over here. Come and show me what some of these. Oh, you don't dare, huh? You have other collections besides those in here now, Addie?
You know why?
Downstairs?
One of those, 2 of those, we just don't throw in the way. One is very repetitious and so forth, and so you wouldn't be happy with that. But wait a minute. You talked about people coming here. The thing I do with people. They have, now wait a minute, we serve everybody, and you never hurt anybody's feelings. But
you never hurt mine.
I
just can't get out of here once I get in, that's
as
all.
Carefully as you can, you try to convert a child or a person to understanding why their people had migrated here at the time they migrated, and how it fits into New York State history and into world history, as I showed you about your ghost towns. Yes. That is Cleveland's era, and it is also Disco's especially, though. So watch, can't make a living there, you go somewhere else. And they went along to Connecticut on the ocean front, and they established a trade with China. You know, if one thing doesn't work, the hour comes. You know, I did have a person here, a wonderful lady whose husband was eye, ear, nose, and throat out in Boston, beautiful gal, and she was researching her family, and they were up there on the back of Whiteface, Peasleeville. I was trying to recollect here because I'm pulling this out of the starch, but and she did not understand why they left and went to Troy, and she said, my people were very well off. Well, okay, the man had 7 girls, and what do you do in timber country with 7 women? And so he took those 7 women to Troy, to the shirt factory, and they made money, and they married wonderful men, and so forth. But you couldn't do it up in Peasleeville. You see what I mean?
I've known some big families in Peasleyville that stayed there and made out rather well.
I know, but and you see that's very true. When somebody else moves, you can take advantage of it. Maybe you can buy in distress and so forth. But what this lady was so disappointed that they should still have had a wonderful tract up there. But can you see that once you cut the timber off a piece of woodland?
Oh, I know. I'm just kidding you.
And you're feeding 7 women.
I know. I'm just kidding you because I'm talking about the John Marcotte's family where he had 9 girls. And that family turned out rather well. This has been kind of an exciting tour, and I would invite anyone who's interested in the history of Clinton County to come in here and just chat for a minute with Addie Shields, and I promise you that you will become as passionate about history as I am just from talking with her. You can't help it. It rubs off. Because, I talk with my kids, some of my kids and grandchildren now in college, trying to write papers about history. My granddaughter was talking to me the other night, Addie, about writing about the first man on the moon and what impact it had on my life. She looks at that event and what you or I think about is happening yesterday in history, and it's so divorced from her time she can't tie it in. So I spend an hour with her, about 58 minutes more than she wanted me to, trying to tie that in with history. Why that was significant for me. That's exactly what you try to do when people come and talk to you. Mm-hmm. You try to make them feel deeply about something that, sure, it's a long time ago, but they're part of the line. They're part of those people that lived there, and they should be able to feel what those people felt by understanding how the history ties in. And you've done a wonderful job at that today. What have you got in your hands there?
The other thing I wanted to bring out was that with every when you do genealogy, every step that you make and you're going back into time, there's a tremendous trauma in the death of that person. And even in, I think of Frank Goodrich's records up in Moores. Yes, New York State mandated the keeping of records in 1880, but Moores in Centerville is way up there in the North Country. It's high, it's cold, and somebody who died in December who may have been placed in the vestibule of St. Anne's Church, they may not have gotten into the records because we have checked some of them, and they aren't in Albany and they aren't up there. And you have to look at this as climatic conditions. Right. I wanted him to see this too.
President Taft in Plattsburgh, July 4th.
And that's on the steps of where Ron Stafford is.
July.
Did you notice too, these are McClellan?
Well.
These are the 153 cemeteries.
Wait a minute. Let me get over there where the microphone is. Those are the what?
The 153 cemeteries that McClellan did of Clinton County. And these, of course, are the repertoires. And these repertoires, not only of Clinton County, these are Catholic marriages, not only of Clinton County, but of the churches along the river, along the Richelieu River, because the Richelieu River was the avenue down. Even it is David Fitzsimmons who found that somebody's papers, when Prevost was trying to come down here, he was being advised that it was just a morass. You could not come from Fort Chamblay and Saint Jean down here by land. It was just a mess. Okay? And all right, so they came by water. The point of it is the land army, it wasn't possible. They came by water, and therefore these are Napierville, La Prairie, and Lacadie. Lacadie had a church in 1784, and St. Luke, which is near, had 1803, but Saint Jean, which is on the river, didn't have a church till 1828. That shows you how safe it was on the river. Some water.
This is amazing. Now, take a look at this, Calvin, if you can. I don't know how close you want to get to it, but this is on the steps of 1 Cumberland Avenue. Many people here who've been around for a long time remember this as the home of the American Legion Post 20. We've attended many services there before the giant fire. And then they moved, of course, to the Quarry Road, and we've been there numerous times as well. But then it was restored, and is now law offices, of course. But this is President Taft in Plattsburgh, New York, on July 4th, and I think that's 1909. What would that be? What's the date on that, Addie?
That's when Taft was here in 1909. That's the tercentenary. Because in as much as, people are proud. You can work hard, but you do it, you're proud. You may be very, very tired at night. But the next morning, you realize that you really accomplished what you set out to do. And that's great. You did something. And so our people were mostly agrarian related. If you made horse collars, it was agrarian related, or whether you were whatever. Anyhow, when our United States of America was 100 years old, there was a real surge to record. And then they had the fairs and so forth. And at the turn of the century, and then with the tercentenary, again, the surge to record. And so when we had a great affair here at the turn of the century, and we are going forward right now with, as we look forward to the year 2000, irrespective of KY2, we are right here in Plattsburgh on the corridor, but also not only on the corridor, but here with this Battle of Plattsburgh, which really was the end of the war. And we are anticipating many things to draw tourists here, but for identification, for children, and always for pride. Not only the tercentenary of Champlain finding us 200, you see, 9, or do we find it 2014? And relative to the corridor, we put the corridor together last year, and we identified every historic spot from the Essex County border up straight through to Fort Chamblay. Because if you're going to teach a child about Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, you better start at the north end of this, because the aggression at that time came from the north. And we had Marjorie Smith and Larry Lowenthal here relative to the establishment of the corridor. And you look at what Frank Pabst has done. Frank Pabst has really done a wonderful, you listen to him, and he's quite correct. And he has that boat, and he makes, our season is short, and you go there and you look at the dock. Art Cohn, we went to Fort Lennox, to Illinois in August, late August, and Art Cohn spoke to us relative to Parks Canada dedicating a cemetery up there, and it was Benedict Arnold Cemetery. They had been being pursued by a land army, and the British forces could not get any further than they did not have water transportation. So when Benedict Arnold landed his forces on Illinois, they could rest because the British did not have boats. And Art Cohn he was using the surgeon's records, and he portrayed to us the macabre situation, the stark situation of a surgeon not having any medication, having used them all the way from Quebec City down. And
well, we got a new battery in. Calvin tried to give me the high sign that the battery was running out, but you were talking about, imagine what it's like for a surgeon or a doctor without having proper medication. Terrible.
Well, what Art Cohn was interpreting to us, what he picked up from the surgeon's records, that they had not had reinforcements, they had no medications at all. All they could do was leave people quiet, and they died there. And so Parks Canada dedicated that burial site where there are 200 American soldiers up there on Illinois, up there now. And we loved Art Cohn for his portrayal of that and what he taught us. But I saw something else, because when we got up there to their center, they have about a 500-foot dock, the most beautiful dock you've ever. And there they have 2 ferries to take you over, and at Illinois they have another tremendous dock and so forth. And that, I'm saying that Parks Canada did that. Now, by contrast, give the Juniper credit. That poor man has to fix his dock himself, and you walk on that boat on a ramp. And if we had the corridor, we would have some federal money spent here, just as it was in
I got it held right up here, the lighthouses.
Just as it was on the lighthouses in that.
Talk about that.
Okay, so the first one was put there at Juniper Island, and in 1826. You go ahead with that. In 1826, and the reason in Juniper was that the greatest. Now remember, we had 5 mountain ranges. And therefore, when the Canadians were shipping timber or whatever they shipped down this, whether it was grain, and they wanted it to go to Boston or whatever, the Burlington port has always been greater than ours because of our isolation, because the 5 mountain ranges south of us. And we didn't have a railroad until 1875. All right, so that first lighthouse was Juniper Island, and the next one was down there at Split Rock. And the reason there is because Split Rock, you see, the lake narrows up there. But right there in Essex, all the iron was coming down there. And this is before the Civil War. Now, we had said that the Northwest Territory was started in 1787. By 1789, the next thing that our new little government did was have a lighthouse service, because they had already inherited 5 along the Atlantic coast. And one of them is that Brewster Island that you see in Boston, if you get to Boston Harbor and so forth. The other, before they built any here, they built 2 on Lake Erie. And that was to get that grain up to the Welland Canal to come across and come through. Then they built the one in Plattsburgh in 1838 at Cumberland Head. And if you look at that, you can see how your route is straight south. You see, straight south. The route is on our side. It's not on the Vermont side. The Vermont side, see all the curlicues and all the little snug harbors you got over there. You can build over in Burlington, never get caught. If you tried to build something on our side, you'd get caught, and it would destroy no investment on our side because you'd get caught doing it, because that's a military highway. All right, but also, since the route is on our side, then notice the next one, 1838, is Cumberland Head. And incidentally, too, we just had Benson and Lawson came south. John Benson Lawson came south, recreating the Civil War, and he did this from Montreal down, just as the invading army would come. And when he got to Cumberland Head, he put a lighthouse down there. And that picture, he was drawing it in 1861, and yes, there was a lighthouse there, but there was not that kind of a lighthouse there, and that's a little error. Can you see what I mean? People make errors sometimes if they get out of text. All right, and then there were 3 that are known as the 3 Sisters, and that's Point of Rush and Windmill Point and Isle Mont. And then when you get down these others, and the one on Valcour Island, they speak of it as Bluff Point here. This is the last one, 1874. Now think of something. That's the last lighthouse that was put on here, because something happened after that. The railroad went south. They finally got it around Willsboro. You get out on a boat and you see the train curving around in that little, they've just carved out a little path on Willsboro Mountain, you know. And then, all right, so they got the train south, 1875. They put that lighthouse there, 74. But with that train south started hauling freight, and your water transportation fell off. So that's your last lighthouse. But
Very interesting. And there are so many.
Mention Sid Couchy does these.
Our good friend Sid Couchy, one of the most charming personalities on the face of the earth, with his little trademark signature on the bottom. There are so many different directions you can take when you study history. It's much more fun. You know, when we were youngsters, we studied state history. We studied world history. We very rarely studied local history. And now we're trying to get that going in our schools again. So all the areas, schools teach a little bit about what life was like in the beginnings of our nation and before, in this very spot that we're standing on, so that the young people can get a feeling, can taste the flavor of history. And when Addie gets involved, you learn about history on every possible level, including what your great-great-grandfather felt like when he stood on Cumberland Head or wherever it happened to be. But that's the feeling you have. You have a wonderful passion for history. You've imparted that passion to thousands of people, and I hope you'll continue to do it for many, many years to come, Addie Shields.
Thank you much.
Thanks so much for having us in your office today. I can't imagine a pleasanter place to spend an afternoon than right here talking with you. And with that, folks, I don't know how we're ever going to top this interview. Probably never, but we will try. Who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner. I just want our viewers across northern New York to know that you're studying history all the time and doing significant things to honor historical figures. And recently we honored an historical figure down in the Ellenburg area, and people are going to get a view of what that was like. Explain what we're going to see.
Well, in order to understand, okay, in Ellenburg, as of the 22nd, we unveiled a marker to Lucy Hobbs Taylor, who fits into this history and fits into that railroad because she was 18 years old. When she was 18 years old, that railroad took her not to Boston, where everything was possibly old hat, but to the adventure of the Midwest. But how did we get into that? In the first place, the year of 1998 is the year of the 150th anniversary of the first Women's Rights Conference, which was held in Seneca Falls in Seneca Falls in 1848. All right. The last thing that Mr. Legislator Simcoe did, and you know our people are very abreast of what's happening. Simcoe brought forth last December, the last meeting of the legislature, a motion whereby he requested that the legislature honor the first woman who served in elected position in Clinton County. And I came back after Christmas, and Anna Hebert had on my desk here, who is this? And so now, in order to know who this is, the 19th Amendment came in 1920. It was approved in August by all the states, and the women voted in 1920. And therefore, you would look at the oaths not only in the county from 1920 on, but from every one of the 14 towns and 4 villages to find out who these women were. So I got out letters to the 14 towns, to the town clerks, but they may not have been very happy because they also collect taxes. And there were adjoining letters to their historians asking if they would help. The next bit is that we had an ice storm, and I came back here in these small 2 rooms, had about 24 forest rangers, some of the nicest young men in the North Country. They'd taken everything off the desk, the typewriter, everything was on the floor, but we managed, great people, for a couple of weeks. Then I got into it, and by the end of February, we had a list of women who had served in Clinton County for, there are 160 of them. But before we finished that, we had a word from Don Garrett, the chairman, asking, since Leahy was busy with the corridor on the east side of the lake, on the Vermont side, we should be aware of that on this, our west side, in order to involve. And we had Marjorie Smith and Larry Lowenthal here from the National Park Service out of Boston. We had 49 people at that meeting, and we compiled a listing of every one of the historic points from Essex County through to Chamblay. But before we finished that, the 15th of March, we had a letter from the executive chambers whereby the governor had set up a commission to honor women with Lynn Rollins as the chairman, and she was requesting every one of the townspeople to submit 3 names. Who were the women? Who were 3 names? Who were 3 women who had their lives were excellent relative to the culture, the addition of culture and education of the area. All right, we got busy on that, and by July we knew that they had chosen Lucy Hobbs Taylor. They chose her because the work that in 1866, when she graduated, see, she was born in 1833, so at 33 years old, she had an accredited diploma from an accredited college as a dental surgeon. And, all right, we knew that she was one of the first women who had belonged to a dental society. But a woman called us who was faculty from the New York State University at Buffalo, their College of Dentistry, part of the faculty there, saying, I have placed this woman's name in the Hall of Fame, and I want to be there when you unveil that marker, because this marker was done in the tradition of New York State's putting out markers. Every county, the 62 counties, each county was to have a new marker, and ours was Lucy Hobbs Taylor. This meant it was Ellenburg. Well, when they did this in July, it came through, the title came through as Lucy H. Taylor. and by telephone. I said, don't you dare let the foundry put that together. That's Hobbs territory up there. You got to have that Lucy Hobbs. Now, there are rules with the foundry. There are rules with the foundry that the first, the title is only have 15 letters. So for the title, we put in memoriam of Lucy Hobbs Taylor, and then her date and what she did. But we did not know, and it is this woman from Buffalo who has studied her life, and a gentleman by the name of Ring, who had retired. He's 88 now. He had retired from the University of Buffalo in their faculty and had done this history of dentistry. And he proved that at the time in 1866, when she received this degree, that she was the first woman in the world from an accredited college. And incidentally, from my house, I called her to Buffalo. You know, you think nothing, you get a bill and you pay it. And I called her and I said, look, so where were the other places? You know, where was McGill? And she said that in 1866 they were Baltimore, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And you see most of our dentists here early had come from McGill and so forth. Now, that meant, now my Charlotte was very great to me in that she was able to help me out. She said, you know, Mama, there are 3 women dentists in Clinton County. One of them is Ann Spear. The other one is Linda Shepard. And there's another, it doesn't come to me right now. But the other bit is that Dr. John Boulay and Roger were both dentists from the University of Buffalo, one in 1964, and Ann Boulay Spear from in 91. However, I didn't know that. She kept asking me for things. I had to send her things. I worked 7 days a week since she called me on the 28th day of October wanting to know when this was going to be. And so in one of the letters, I said, I have a word from Ann Spear saying that she would be present and so forth, and we'd use her for the reception committee. And she called me back about something because she needed to know how long it would take. We were going to have that meeting at 1. We're going to have it at 1:30. We're going to have it at 2 o'clock. She needed to get back to Montreal for 5 o'clock. And she wanted to know how long it would take. Well, you know how long it takes to get across the customs is a question mark. And so at that same time, she said to me, reading that footnote I had, you know, I believe I had Ann Spear as a student, and didn't I have 2 of her brothers? Isn't her name Boulay?
Isn't it amazing how small the world is?
And we were very happy to have Dr. Napinski because she brought us material that we did not know. We were not aware of the fact that that status was 1866, the first woman in the world. We did not know that.
That's so neat. So you get a chance to see it today and enjoy it right here on Hometown Cable.